If you're taking on the role of being a director, you've signed up for a big task.
Making sure companies are paying for performance is the biggest challenge facing compensation committees today.
Corporate Board Member presents the Board Governance Series, with series contributors PricewaterhouseCoopers and Meridian Compensation Partners. On this edition of the Board Governance Series, Becoming the Optimal Audit Committee, with Dawn Keller, Partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers Center for Board Governance.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of the Board Governance Series. Today I'm speaking with Dawn Keller from PricewaterhouseCoopers Center for Board Governance. Dawn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Perhaps the most significant obligation of the Audit Committee is oversight of the company's financial statements. What best practices have you learned with regards to that obligation?
Well, I think there are tremendous demands that are placed on the Audit Committee, certainly with regard to their busy schedule, their extensive responsibilities. It's important for them to focus on the more important aspects that are included in the accounts and the financial statements. For example, complex transactions is an area that requires that kind of focus. That could be revenue recognition, it could be income tax accounting, but if committee members will invest more of their time in the complex areas and less time in the basic plain vanilla areas, that certainly can enhance their effectiveness and efficiency. If there are unusual transactions that are non-recurring or special that are recorded during the period, that's another area where the Audit Committee should focus its attention, and those items should be highlighted by management. And lastly, areas involving significant amounts of judgment on the part of management. They generally create estimates, say the allowance for bad debts or reserve for obsolete inventories, are areas where the amount of conservatism that is baked into the estimate and the preparation and the assumptions can certainly have an impact on the quality of the earnings for the period.
Are there some enabling approaches that the audit committees can use?
Well, absolutely. As I mentioned, I think if management will prepare a schedule of unusual, infrequent, or special item transactions that occurred during the quarter and show the pre-tax impact, the related tax effect, the after-tax effect, and the impact on net income and even on earnings per share, incredibly useful tool for the Audit Committee to get their arms around that which is unique during the quarter. I also think it is beneficial for the Audit Committee to invest at least one meeting a year diving into the details of the more complex accounts, whether it's revenue recognition or, as I mentioned, income tax accounting, to allow them to gather more insight, more understanding into those areas, again, which are perhaps more complex than other areas of the financial statements. It's also useful for Audit Committee members to listen to the analyst calls when the company releases its earnings. So not perhaps as important to listen to the script that they've already reviewed before the call occurs, but during the Q&A, the analysts have a tendency to focus on those things they're most interested in, and that can be insightful for an Audit Committee member to understand what key performance indicators are of greatest interest to the analyst community, or even what the analyst community may be concerned about.
The internal audit relationship can be a huge advantage for audit committees. How can committees get the most out of that relationship?
Well, it certainly could be the Audit Committee's best friend. I think the real key to effectiveness in the internal audit function is empowerment, ensuring that all areas within the organization recognize the importance of the Audit Committee role, and that is empowered by the board, the Audit Committee, and the CEO as well, sends an important message about the importance of compliance throughout the company.
What about the external audit function? How can audit committees maximize that relationship?
Well, I think it starts with looking at that relationship as being much more than just a compliance exercise that's required by regulation, and to try and take advantage of having an independent third-party external advisor In order to do that, it's important that audit committee chairs, I think, try and meet with the engagement partner at least once a year, if not more frequently, outside of the formal meetings that are being held. I also think private sessions at each and every audit committee meeting with the external auditor are of critical importance, but an open and candid dialogue is critical, and starting with asking the right questions so audit committee members are prepared when they go into private sessions to ask meaningful questions to elicit insightful responses from the external audit partner, the external audit team, is important.
Preventing fraud is of utmost concern to audit committees. How can they work to mitigate that risk?
Well, I think fraud prevention and mitigating controls really start with the tone at the top. Survey data will suggest that the CEO of a company is probably 95% responsible for establishing the proper tone at the top, and certainly the board plays a role as well, but the CEO's impact is pervasive throughout the organization. An SEC study even indicated that in the case of overpowering CEOs, dominant CEOs, that is the primary reason for a CFO to commit financial reporting fraud, more so than personal greed or gain, in order to look better in the eyes of the boss. I also think audit committees need to be alert to red flags.
And what might some of those red flags be?
Well, certainly an overpowering CEO, overly focused on metrics, the financial results, and the numbers that are short-term driven rather than perhaps long-term shareholder value based. I think it's also important that the company pay attention to what's coming through the whistleblower hotline and what types of patterns emerge from that type of reporting. I think considering the upward feedback that executives may be receiving from the HR department is another good way, certainly, to assess the tone at the top, because if there is a suggestion that the feedback of those around management executives is unfavorable, that's probably something that the audit committee should have an awareness of.
Bribery fraud appears to be on the radar screen of regulators. Would you agree with that? Absolutely.
Bribery fraud has gone through the top of the charts, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. The Department of Justice and the SEC have been extremely busy. Since 2010, $1.5 billion of criminal penalties have been paid under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So without a doubt, tremendous focus on bribery fraud. I think there's actions that committees can certainly do in order to try and mitigate the risk of fraud. The challenges, though, are fairly immense. I think the key to all that is education across the organization, the right tone at the top, and ensuring that there's a sincere understanding of what the potential impact of having a bribery and corruption issue within the organization, how negatively that can impact the company, its brand, and its value.
These tips are so important for audit committees to be thinking about, Don. So thank you very, very much for coming to share some best practices with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of the Board Governance Series.
Don Keller can be reached at don.keller@us.pwc.com. The Board Governance Series is a presentation of Corporate Board Member, an NYSE Euronext company.